Sunday afternoons, Sarah and her extended family, that means her brothers, her parents, and her grandparents, spend the afternoons at a tenant farm that the family owns. Do you know what a tenant farm is? The family owned the farm, but another family actually lived on the farm. And they work the crops, they plant the crops and harvest them and take care of the livestock, and then they keep a share of the profits and give the rest back to the owners of the farm. That's a tenant farm. Sunday afternoons, Sarah and her family go to this tenant farm and spend the afternoon there, having a picnic and playing in the creek and all of those things. So this scene then is set on one of those Sunday afternoons, and the grandfather has just ridden up on a very prized stallion. You ready? The animal, a thoroughbred grandson of Manowar, pranced, angling sideways, the reins so taut the stallion sometimes bobbed its long head and snorted, its nostrils ruffling, its agitated lips showing yellow teeth. My grandfather, not looking his 74 years, rode as if floating, directing the animal with his knees. His legs squeezed, pressing, and the horse whinnied, pumped its head. My grandfather kicked, yanking the reins to his chest. The horse lurched, then reared, waving its front hooves, working its tongue at the metal bit. I stepped back. My mother ambled toward the creek. My grandfather jerked the reins harder, gave another kick. The horse bowed, then quivered, stumbling, sullenly righting itself. Its eyes bulged, blood drooled from the split corners of its mouth. A moment later, it padded forward, ears pricked. As they approached the table, my grandfather waved his fedora, a one-man parade, his pedigreed mount subdued. All of us, except my mother, pointed, calling out as we hurried toward him. He dismounted, and my father slapped the stallion's neck. "You've been taking a few lessons?" he teased my grandfather. "Like a nice ride in the park," he added, holding the reins, his grin a false note. I checked the tension around his eyes, thinking maybe I'd mistaken his irritation for teasing, or that he'd somehow decided hurting a horse was okay. After all, his slap had been hard, even if it hadn't drawn blood, like my grandfather's jerks at the reins did. "Fine animal," my grandfather said. He rubbed its rangy forehead, then smacked its flank. The horse flinched, shifted its footing. "He's spirited, but manageable." "Yes, sir," my father said, one hand behind his back, the other still holding the reins. His posture gave no indication of his feelings. Relaxed. His was the straightest back I'd seen. His flat expression and stiff back, though, made me sad. "I expect you to show him a thing or two, boy." "Yes, sir," my father answered, nodding in regimental rhythm, his gaze on the empty horizon. That look reminded me of the times he'd playfully hung me or one of my brothers over our second-floor banister, or once when he pretended to shut Sam in the car trunk. I thought my brother would suffocate and begged, "Daddy, don't." My father wasn't being mean. In fact, we all laughed when Sam tumbled out, our father tickling us both. But we were never to show that we were frightened. There were rules. I was sure they were meant to teach some lesson, since at other times he would pull me close and explain one of his points of philosophy. Number one, happiness is primarily an attitude. Number two, even Moses was punished when he made his one mistake. Number three, problems can be corrected through a systematic identification of facts. Although I couldn't give a reason for not saying, "Sometimes you scare me," I always kept silent. Sam approached, pulling back the horse's lip. "Is his mouth cut?" "No, boy," our father said, pushing Sam's hands. "Go see if Gran needs help unloading the car." "Where's Noreen?" my grandfather asked, waving in her direction. "Hey, girl, I'd like to see you ride," he shouted. Sam frowned, then turned toward the creek. My mother squatted at the bank. She wore a frayed straw hat and looked through cat's eye sunglasses over her shoulder, swatted the air twice, then turned back. She'd bragged that her name appeared by itself on the farm deed. While my father was overseas tending wounded soldiers during the war, she'd moved in with my grandparents and scrimped each month to pay the token $15 mortgage before buying necessities for herself, Kurt, who was a baby then, and Sam, who arrived a few months after our father left. Investment, my grandfather had reminded her. Consider it my thanks to a son's faithful wife. Now, as he watched her, the horse nudged him off balance. He shoved back, and the animal thumped its rear hooves, yanked its head. "Ho!" my father said, holding out his hand. I wonder if he always believed Granddaddy was right. Would he do anything his father asked? I hoped not. "You go then," my grandfather said, his face red, puckered. "Get Hugh there and convince me I wasn't wrong to pay good money for that sorry piece of horse flesh." "Yes, sir," my father said, calling Hugh. "I'm checking the peach trees," my grandfather said to no one in particular, as he waded through broom grass toward a small orchard my father had planted on the other side of the road. Once he'd plopped Hugh behind the saddle horn, my father swung up, their bodies snug in the leather seat. "That way," Hugh said, signaling toward the barn. "Cows! Daddy, hurry!" He waved as they swayed with each of the horse's steps, their hips ticking right, then left. My mother strolled toward a mass of vines below the train trestle, then disappeared, collecting Mustang grapes in a coffee can. My grandmother headed for evening primroses clustered next to a crepe myrtle. "We don't like lemonade. I hope you didn't bring lemonade," Sam said, as my grandmother snapped flower stems, discarding all but perfect blooms. "Whoever perished being innocent," she said, pity shaping a smile, a typical condescension whose source was mysterious. Then she sang, her reedy voice garbling lyrics, except in the occasional clear note, the words blessing and thou. "Last one to the water," Kurt yelled. Then he, Sam, and I raced each other to the creek. My brothers had worn bathing suits under their jeans, so they peeled off their pants, left them on the bank. Stripped to my panties, I stepped into the cool water, and Sam dove past me into the shadowed depths. Kurt soaked me with a cannonball dive. Fine silt blackened our bottoms as we slid from algae-slick rocks to mud, soft as feathers. If I stood flat-footed in the small swimming hole, the top just covered my head. We slapped water at each other, and I barely escaped their pinches and efforts to push me under. We forgot we were two boys and one girl with rules we'd learned about how one should behave with the other. Just three children in the water and mud, our tanned arms and legs gleaming, sharp stones pricking our toughened feet. Every so often, one of us called another's name, and these shouts, mixed with giggling and thwaps of splashed water, echoed back toward our mother, father, grandparents. By the time my grandfather had returned to the table with a basket of peaches, we'd put on our jeans again and we raced toward him. My grandmother joined us, strands of gray hair stuck to her damp face. Kurt and Sam threw their pits at each other as our father and Hugh came riding up. "I want one," Hugh cried, reaching toward the basket, slipping, tumbling to the ground. He whimpered, clutching his arm. My father stepped down. "Guess we could amputate just about here," he teased, the side of his hand slicing above Hugh's elbow. "No," Hugh whined, rubbing. "It's okay, honest." We laughed and shoved him, but our father's message was clear. Father took the horse's reins in one hand and used his other to motion again in wide arcs. "Now, Noreen, I'd like to see what you can do." She'd gathered stalks of purple horsemen and wispy old man's beard in a peanut butter jar and was leaning over the table, but she stopped, her arm a warning flag. "No, thank you," she said, her words heavy as the heat, and set down the flowers. My grandfather dropped his hand and watched her poking her arrangement. "Now, Miss Noreen, come on, girl." He stroked the horse's neck. "No reason to be afraid. He's a thoroughbred, but a baby could handle him." My mother stiffened, only her head turned. "It's not that I can't ride him," she said. "I just don't care to right now." She rubbed the table with a cloth. My grandfather stood, a corner of his shirt tail hanging, and removed his fedora, then wiped his forehead with his sleeve. We all grew still. "You want everybody to think you can't ride a little old horse? I guess that's your business." He replaced his hat, pushing it back, not looking at her. She faced us, her straw hat's brim a halo, her sunglasses white horns. She marched over, reached toward my grandfather, snatched the reins, and swung onto the saddle. My hands went to my mouth. I winced, ready to cover my eyes. Leaning right, she flicked her heels. The horse twirled, cantered, then galloped toward the trestle at a high speed. At the edge of the field, she turned, hunched into the wind, and aimed at us, her finish line. As the horse gathered speed, its rocking gait smoothed into a streak. When they stopped, dust and dirt kicked our feet. Dismounting, my mother tossed the reins back at my grandfather. "I told you I could ride it," she said through clenched teeth. "What I said was that I didn't want to." "Yeah, she told you," Sam said. But to me, a child whose world was still family, my mother's defiance was like cursing God in the middle of a sermon. I'd never seen anyone, particularly a woman, talk to my grandfather like she had. Why, even Gran called him Dr. Pelton, and she never questioned anything he said or talked back. Neither did my father. The church taught about resurrected saints, betrayals in the garden, so I knew that committing a sin was scary. Dad's switch had proved it. But this time, I knew my grandfather was wrong. And sin or no sin, I wanted to tell him that, but couldn't. My grandfather slapped his leg with his hat, then repositioned it. He led the horse toward the creek for a drink. My mother rolled up the cuffs of Hugh's jeans and gave a hugging laugh while patting his bottom. Why wasn't my grandfather mad? Had my mother known she could talk to him like that? Maybe there were times when rules could be broken, but which ones and how? At least now I knew to ask. Okay, that's the end of that scene. So you have a little picture of the family, right? And you can see that the men are in charge. But Sarah's mother has an inclination to break some of those rules. And suddenly Sarah is beginning to want to know more. And Sam is there to help her out. So now the next scene. This scene also takes place the same afternoon. And Sam has just called Sarah over to the farm creek and he wants to show her something. Sarah says this, she says this at the beginning of this chapter. She says that during what happens next, Sam is teaching her his version of the truth. Okay, this is Sam and Sarah. "Stay here," he said, and waded into the creek. He stopped and stared into the darkness. This time, his breathing hardly raised his chest. Only his eyes moved, followed some creature below as it passed. Another turtle? The two middle fingers on his left hand twitched. Cicadas rattled like tambourines. The stream pattered across rocks. Mosquitoes whirled. Sam's hands pierced the surface and fell deep, the water above his elbows. I ran to the edge. The toes of my tennis shoes sank into silt. He lurched backward, then tossed the creature and tunnel of water forward. Drops fanned around his head, thumping as they splashed. Almost a foot long, the fish flopped, slithering in the muddy shallow. When I reached him, Sam held the fish with its mouth, while its mouth yawned, then closed, and the tail curled like a tongue, the body all muscle as it jerked, flipping in my brother's hands. I imagined the bass, with its green back, black side stripes and orange circles around popping eyes, flopping between my own fingers, wanting its cool home. Daddy and Granddaddy cut open the body so they can see the stuff inside, Sam said. He crouched on the bank, reached into his pocket. I bent next to him but pressed my fist to my chest. The fish's gills fluttered. I saw you watching all them. He motioned with his head back toward the others as he withdrew a knife, pulled out its blade with his teeth. Don't let it get to you. We're not like that. His eyes peered into mine. I want you to see this. Can you take it? When I nodded, he knelt as he slid the steel into the anus, then sliced forward through white belly, splintering ribs. The wafer-like flaps still puffed as he cut through them on either side. He laid the knife next to his knee and pulled back on the head, cracking bones, then yanked it off. He set the head next to his knife. One orange haloed eye stared at sky. Why'd you do that? I asked, not letting myself turn away. My brother had killed it just so he could show me something. I had to watch. Sometimes you got to do ugly things, he said, but he didn't look at me. Even though he was mangling the fish, I trusted him because he always took care of me. Sam stuck his hand inside the body, tugged at the gullet casing. He ripped the intestinal sac loose with a snap. He dropped the bass, holding its insides in the air, the torn end that had once connected to the head pointing to the ground. About the size of our father's index finger, the sac was pear-shaped and gray with threads of red membrane, muscle. It tapered into something like a tail. Pinching what had been the bottom of the gullet, Sam squeezed, raking the casing in jerks. A larval insect with a crowd of legs popped out, landed on the ground, and thrashed its whip-shaped body back and forth, its head sprouting pincers that searched for a target. Then the sac spit out pillbugs and algae, snails, tiny clam-like animals, all dead. Alive, they'd been cramped inside what must have seemed like a cavernous pouch. Sam pressed again, and shells and plants oozed free until something larger neared the opening. It was brown and had a tiny curled paw. He punched at the casing, and the dark mass fell next to the wiggling grub. This new creature had a face and white eyelids, delicate in their tiny perfection. Hair covered its limp body, and the feet touched one another, while the head curved toward the tail as if to rest there. I rubbed the fuzz around the mouse's ears. What had it been doing in the water? And why hadn't it chewed its way out of the fish? When a green liquid squirted from the sack onto the pile of creatures and plants, Sam tossed the limp casing to the side. Know what this is? He asked as he picked up the writhing insect, allowing it to creep across his palm, fingers, back of his hand. I giggled nervously, imagining how it would feel to swallow something alive, hoping he wouldn't expect me to hold the thing like he'd once dared me to touch a jumping crawdad. What? I said. Hellgrammite. Turns into a fly with a giant claw and only flies at night, he whispered. Looks a little like Granddaddy, don't you think? He rested the flat of his hand on the dirt, and the insect scuttled into the grass. He flipped open one of the clam-like shells. Inside lay a soft animal, cooked. Can you eat those? I asked. I don't know, he said. Let's see. And he scraped one loose, rubbed it onto his tongue. He chewed twice, shrugged. What did it taste like? I imagined salty flesh, slipperiness as I swallowed. Too little, he said, poking at the pile of small animals and debris. His hands were child-sized, but muscled, meticulous as a surgeon's. Those could be you and me, Kurt and Hugh, right? He smiled. And the mouse has to be Mama, I said. No, that's you, he said. And these, he pointed at the shells, are all your babies. They were fluted, smaller than thumbtacks. I was hoping to find a young bass. They're cannibals, you know. His eyes commanded an answer, so I shook my head. No. Did animals realize they were eating their own kind? Or did they gobble out of instinct? Fish don't feel stuff. I mean, they don't hurt like us, right? Nah, not possible, he said. Their brains, he made a tiny circle with his index finger and thumb, are no bigger than your fingernail. The circle's ratio to fish body was disturbing when compared to my brain-body proportions. He wiped his knife on his thigh, popped it closed, slid it into his pocket. Let me pick this stuff up. We better get back. He gathered bass parts in his hands. I scooped up the fish's head and reached for the mouse. The orange circled eye glared from one palm, the sleeping baby curled in the other. The fuzzy hair and scales, the delicate paw and loose gills were now familiar as my own skin. From then on, I decided, I'd be as devouring as a bass, a truth scavenger. Okay, so there's the second part. Now, for those of you who are creeped out by that, this is the English teacher, all right? I want to tell you what I think Sam was doing. He says to her, can you look at this? Are you brave enough to look at this? And then he shows her all of these things. As the writer, I'm thinking the fish for him is like a metaphor for life. And what he's saying is, a life is full of mystery and beautiful things and awesome things and gruesome things and scary things. And in the midst of all of that, you know what he's telling her? You gotta keep looking. You gotta still be a part of it. Don't turn away. Now this is an irony, because after Sam dies, Sarah becomes a recluse. She separates herself from friends, family. She has no relationships. She focuses only on, is it time?